And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Jim Baxter, Director of the Environment and Energy Division, and also my boss, to say a few words and introduce today's guest speaker. Over to you, Jim.
Nancy, thanks so much for that. It's my job to welcome everyone here today. And, you know, given the year that we've just come through, I think it's amazing that we can have an event like this, hold it virtually, and attract more than 100 people. So I think that's absolutely marvelous, and thank you all for signing up for the event. The Environment and Energy Division is tasked with managing the city's transition to a net zero economy by 2050 or before. And as part of that, there is a recognition that we not only have to look at cars and buildings, but we also have to pay significant attention to the natural environment here at the city as well. And to that end, in 2016, the city of Toronto became Canada's first bee city. By my count, there are now 48 bee cities. So, you know, leadership is always a great thing. We even adopted our own bee, the Agapostomum virescens, and I'll have Anna Maria correct my pronunciation later. In 2018, the pollinator strategy that the city developed was approved by council, and in 2019, the city started providing grants to help those who wanted to become more pollinator friendly in their own places. It's now my privilege to introduce our guest speaker today. I have to just find my note on that. Scott MacIvor. Scott is a community ecologist and assistant professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. He's interested in plants, pollinators, especially bees, and their interactions in cities and across different urban green spaces. He's authored over 50 publications on these topics, and his lab collaborates with stakeholders both locally and globally to enhance biodiversity conservation in cities. Scott is a great friend of the Environment and Energy Division, working closely with us as we created our pollinator strategy in 2018. So without any further ado, Scott, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jim. I guess I'll get right started. Let me just share my screen. Here it is. Hopefully you can all see that. Because I can't see any of you, but that's okay. This wild world we're living in right now, everything delivered virtually. Usually we love giving these kinds of presentations in person, but in my teaching at the University of Toronto, I've had lots of experience delivering lectures, I mean, from my living room here. So thanks so much to all of you for attending, and certainly the city for supporting this really great opportunity to talk a little bit about Toronto's wild bees, their diversity, and how to get involved in supporting them. I'll talk a little bit about each of these in this kind of in 3 different sections in this talk. And as you just heard, I'm at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, where we mostly pursue work on bees. What you're seeing in front of us on this screen right now are cavity nesting bees. These are solitary bees. Actually, the species is Megachile campanula, the small resin bee. And what you're seeing here is each individual bee here, there's 2 on the screen. These are individual females. And unlike honeybees or bumblebees, which are social, these bees are solitary. And so every female is her own queen. She makes her own nests, lays her own eggs, and goes about her business focusing solely on her own brood. So this will be a large portion of the kinds of bees we're talking about today. Okay, there we go. So this is just a few examples of a number of different bees that often occupy those bee hotels or trap nests that we use to study cavity nesting bees in Toronto. And I'll talk a bit about those kinds of bees, as well as the majority of bees that we find in Toronto, which are ground nesting bees. I don't have a poll option, and I can't really ask the audience right now, but normally I would, and I would ask which one of these is not a bee. One of them isn't. One of them is actually a wasp. And it's the one on the bottom left corner. This is Leucospis affinis, which is a very large parasitoid of many bee species, especially mason bees. So just briefly before I get into it, a little bit about what we do in the lab. We're really interested in biodiversity in cities at the kind of nexus of design and urban planning. So we think about biodiversity in two ways. One, biodiversity as a tool to support growing cities and the ecosystem services that we depend on, like pest control and pollination. We're also interested in interactions that can be negative with growing cities, including invasive species management and their impacts on biodiversity. We do a lot of work engaging the communities. So how can a growing city conserve biodiversity? Why does that matter? And how can we appreciate nature and all its unique features in cities? And we have a really great program led by Live Green Toronto, the Pollinate TO Community Grants Program, which supports funding for community groups to create pollinator gardens and engage with this type of biodiversity. And of course, we're also interested in the aspects of a growing city that impact biodiversity. I mentioned invasive species, but we're really interested in kind of local and landscape level anthropogenic pressures like urbanization and land use change. So we explore all of these different topics in our research lab. And we're growing in small, we're small, but we're mighty, and we're out at Scarborough, but you can often find us, for example, in the Meadowway, the Don Valley. We're often in High Park, and other really unique and charismatic places in our city that support wild bees. So what are wild bees? Well, I mentioned at the beginning, there's solitary, there's social, there's hundreds of species in the region, over 850 in Canada, 4,000 in North America, and upwards of 20,000, definitely more than 20,000 around the world. What's unique about bees, of course, is that they are pollinators. They're the most effective pollinators in all terrestrial environments around the world, apart from Antarctica. And there's a number of really cool evolutionary reasons for why bees are as effective as they are. One of those is, of course, they are covered in hairs, branched hairs, which help collect the pollen grains and other features of flowers that they want to bring back to the nest to feed their larvae and their brood. And what's unique about their hairs is their hairs are not like the ones on my arm here. They're branched hairs. So it's almost like each one of your individual hairs being like a Christmas tree, like hairs on hairs. And this greatly increases their surface area and ability to carry pollen. A lot of bees also are able to buzz at a certain frequency that tells the flower that it is me, the bumblebee. So blueberry flower, open up your flower and pass all of that pollen to me. So it buzzes at a certain frequency in a way that communicates with the flower. And lastly, bees are actually positively charged, whereas floral surfaces and floral elements are negatively charged. So we know how magnets work. And what this means is with these various structures and more that I don't have time to get into, it allows bees to be very effective at collecting pollen, nectar, oils, microbes, etc., from flowers to feed to their larvae. Now, of course, flowers don't do this for free, and flowers have evolved a unique array of structures, complexities, sizes, shapes, timing, etc., to attract their favorite pollinators. Because, of course, they're not giving away this pollen nectar for free, they're doing it to enact sexual reproduction. So many plants depend on insects to pass those pollen grains from flower to flower, which enacts sexual reproduction, fruiting, seed set, and all the yummy fruits that we enjoy. One important thing to note here too, whenever you see a red flower, like a trumpet flower or an Indian paintbrush here, or a cardinal flower, for example, these flowers are red. Bees actually see the color red as black. And so flowers that are red are often actually attracting hummingbirds. And you can think a bit about the structure of those flowers, often very elongate. Okay, so why does bee diversity matter? Of course, as I said, hundreds of different bee species in Toronto and thousands around the world, many different flowers as well that all depend on their favorite types of bees. This network graph illustrates this nicely. So on green, we have bees, and on orange, we have flowers, and all of these interconnected lines in between these two trees here illustrate a typical plant pollinator network. And so this network and the strength of this network adds to the stability and the resiliency of any one particular environment. If one of these nodes disappears, what would that mean for nodes on the other side, right? So if a specialist bee disappears, then the pollination success and ultimately the populations of the flowers it visits could be in peril. So our lab is really interested in these plant pollinator networks to understand the strength, stability, and resiliency of different environments, including cities. Of course, as I mentioned too, bees as pollinators, they're pollinating the native plant assemblages that we find throughout our city, but they're also pollinating a lot of the foods that we appreciate and depend on, especially the colorful and nutritious ones. So from these two images, a little pixelated, but jam and to fruit, nuts and seeds and so forth in our muesli in the corner, the juice in our cup, even the milk in our coffee, we can thank a bee for. Of course, bees are not providing milk, but they are pollinating the main forage for a lot of cattle, right? And that's alfalfa. So the alfalfa leafcutter bee is a bee especially focused on alfalfa flowers. There has been countless studies and many in recent years that have shown the important relationships between bee diversity and the yield of crops, including many plants that people grow in their backyards or in community or allotment gardens. I just grabbed two graphs really quickly to illustrate this, and I could have gone through 100 different crops. This is the first one from blueberries, showing that wild bee richness, so the different types of bees in a particular field visiting specific flowers will greatly increase seed set. Here's another one for pumpkins illustrating the same thing. So what this means is that to maximize yield of these crops, we want different visitors visiting that flower. We wouldn't want 10 visitors to be the same species visiting that flower. We'd want one species visiting, or 10 different species visiting once. And a lot of agriculture, of course, is, and the pollination success of agricultural crops is associated with honeybees. Of course, honeybees aren't wild bees, and they're not the focus of the talk today. Honeybees are social bees, and they're managed pollinators. So we're often seeing them mostly in agricultural environments where we can grow large colonies. These social bees can reach colonies of 20, 30,000 individual bees over a colony life cycle within a season. And this can provide immense pollination services to large kind of conventional agricultural systems. So think like the almond orchards in California as we all drink our almond milk in the morning. This is what these fields look like. There are no other kinds of plants. And because of the intensity of the land use, there are no other kinds of bees either. So the beauty and the amazing use of honeybees as a domesticated agricultural animal means we can go and plop a honeybee hive in this field and pollinate all those almond crops. In cities, perhaps this is less important because, we have a very heterogeneous and diverse land use that supports wild bee species, which is quite cool, this idea that cities could be a refuge for wild bee diversity, and importantly, native wild bee diversity. I was just mentioning earlier, I'm working on a new invasive bee species in Toronto, Osmia cornifrons, but upwards of 90% of Toronto's bee species are native to this region. This graph just shows that along the bottom is the proportion of visits by honeybees, and on the vertical axis is the proportion of plant species in one of those network graphs. And what you can see here is that there are some plants that honeybees visit exclusively, and there are other plants where, in fact, lots of plants where lots of other bees are visiting them as well. So it's really important to acknowledge the difference between wild and native bees and honeybees, especially in cities and natural areas where we're promoting pollinator conservation. And why do we want to conserve pollinators? Well, it is the case that many of them are declining. We're hearing about stories all the time about insect extinctions, right? Mass extinctions of insect biomass in different environments around the world. And bees are also susceptible to these factors. This is a recent paper that came out just a few months ago that suggested, based off of a global biodiversity inventory called GBIF, that upwards of 25% of wild bee species known to science haven't been recorded since the 1990s. So of the 20,000 plus species around the world, there are like 5,000 or more unaccounted for in recent years. And some of these groups that are more common are less affected, and other groups are more affected. But the important message here is that uncommon species are becoming rare, and rare species are becoming locally extinct. And even in Toronto, we are not immune from this. We have one bee species that has ultimately completely disappeared from Southern Ontario, the rusty patch bumblebee, worked on by my colleague Sheila Cole at York University. And we can just go down the list. We know what bees are next to go, right? So the yellow-banded bumblebee is under great pressure now, and there's a lot of researchers focusing on this bee. The factors that cause these declines are diverse and interacting, right? So everything from anthropogenic land use, so land use change, agriculture and pesticides, pathogen transmission from honeybees to bumblebees and so forth, and a myriad of other factors like invasive species changing plant communities and so on. Happy to talk about this more in the Q&A session, but I'll continue to move on, focusing on what we are doing in Toronto and what we're seeing in Toronto. Now, Toronto, of course, is one of the most populated cities in North and Central America. It's also one of the greenest cities among those large major cities. And in Toronto, we've determined that there's upwards of, based on historical records, upwards of 350 species or more within this region. We keep finding new species too. In fact, Jason Gibbs, a former PhD student of Dr. Lawrence Packer, who's now at the University of Manitoba, recently found a brand new species to science not too far from the college TTC station. This is Lasioglossum ephialtum. Ephialtum refers to nightmare. So this is a nightmare bee. It's a nightmare to identify. Many of our bees in Toronto are very small, black or blue, and look very similar to one another. Of course, we're seeing a lot of public engagement and interest in bees in our city. And here's just one of several murals we have around the city. This one by Nick Sweetman, a fabulous artist who creates these beautiful images of wild bees and bees across our city. This bee in particular here, it looks like an Agapestamon bee that was referred to earlier, Toronto's official bee, which I'll show another image of shortly. So lots of engagement, both bottom up, right? So from the public and of course, top down, right? So here we are talking about wild bees in Toronto. And I can just reference very quickly some of the great strides we've made, positive ways forward in supporting wild bees in Toronto. The Bees of Toronto book, part of the City of Toronto Biodiversity series, was published back in 2016. It includes a checklist of all of our bees, artists who use bees in their work, history of beekeeping and bee research in Toronto, places to go bee watching, and on and on. It's a free book available online. We have, of course, we heard the Toronto Pollinator Protection Strategy, which has done quite a great job at putting wild bees first in the context of conservation and land use planning and management, both within departments in the city and with the public. And the last kind of cherry on top recently has been the Pollinate TO Community Grants Program, which allots up to $5,000 for communities around the city to create pollinator gardens. And with that comes engagement opportunities and education and ways to collaborate with researchers and lots of resources and tools and so forth to make sure that this is very effective. So let's look at some of the bees that we have in Toronto. I mentioned cavity nesting bees at the beginning, but let's start with ground nesting bees. Ground nesting bees are upwards of 75% of all the different bee species that we find in Toronto, in tree pits, in lawns, in old sand boxes at parks, in open fields, in forests, all over the place. And we're actually trying to figure out now, moving forward, some of the edaphic and soil preferences that these bees have in our city so that we can be a bit more prescriptive about land management. So you can see to the right here, there's lots of different ways in which these nests manifest underground, and every bee has a different kind of architectural underpinning to their design of their nest underground. Some of them are very shallow and they can nest in flower pots on a condo balcony, and others need much deeper soils like we'd find in High Park that are not compacted, very sandy, open and exposed to sun. We do have a lot of experience going out and finding these bees, and some of them nest very individualistically, like beside a rock on their own, and others will aggregate into communities. And this is where the really cool experiences can be for the public. On the left here, we're actually standing around while there are hundreds of Calades bees, a plaster of bees flying around us, males that are scanning the ground looking for females to emerge to mate with them. It's a really cool experience to get up close and personal with some of these bees. And of course, this can be quite frightening for some people, and it has led to 311 calls asking about bee removal from parks. And of course, we do not want to do that. These bee aggregations could be decades old. And are important to foster and harbor these groups because they're providing significant pollination services. Many of these are pollinating in the spring, so visiting lots of spring flowers like our cherry blossoms in High Park and so forth. So there's been some progress with putting up signs and identifying many of these bees as tickle bees, many of them being very small, unable to sting us because their stingers are so small, or simply just uninterested in us because as solitary bees, if you are your own queen and you have to make your own nest, you don't really want to spend any time protecting others or putting yourself in harm's way. As I said, the other bees are cavity nesting bees, and we often see these being hosted in bee hotels and trap nests, but bee hotels and trap nests only host a handful or a subset of the kinds of cavity nesting bees we find in Toronto. Many of them are looking for old wood logs and stumps, like this one that has lots of beetle bored holes. Others are looking for plant stems where they can dig out the pith from inside. So think sumac, elderberry, raspberry, grape, etc. There's other plants that they're seeking. But we do see a huge phenomena in the last few years of designs to try to encourage these kinds of bees. And as I said, we do some of this work in our lab trying to use these as tools to study bee community ecology and nutrition and so forth. But what we do find is these are overrepresenting non-native cavity nesting bees. And so there's a chance that these efforts may not be supporting conservation in the same way that we want to be conserving native wild bees. We'll talk about that near the end of the talk. But nevertheless, wild bees, especially in our city, include some pretty incredibly adaptive species. And so they're these kind of urban winners, right? Bees that can nest in a old tire or in a metal lawn chair. Is this erroneous behavior, or are they telling us something more unique about them that they're able to use these kind of anthropogenic structures in order to survive and reproduce? We've even found some cavity nesting bees like this leafcutter bee using plastic shopping bags in place of leaves, or that small resin bee I showed you at the beginning using window caulking instead of pine sap to make its nest. So some pretty unique and interesting behaviors are being recorded in cities when we look. Now, let's just go through semi-quickly the kinds of bees that we do see in Toronto. We already mentioned honeybees. Honeybees are closely related to bumblebees and carpenter bees, some of the larger ones that we see around the city. These are in the group Apidae. The sweat bees, so this is that Lasioglossum ephialtum, that nightmare bee. They're really small, black or blue, tiny little bees nesting in flower pots and all over the city. These bees are very diverse, hard to identify, and they also include Toronto's official bee species, which is the one on the top there, Agapestomon virescens. This beautiful green bee that nests in old lawns, and sisters will nest side by side and lay eggs in each other's nests and build these bonds. And so we thought of it as kind of a neighborly bee, which we wanted to kind of promote in Toronto. Andrenids and caledids, these are ground nesting bees. A lot of them are active early in the spring, but of course, like all bees, there's different ones active at different times. These are mostly all nesting in the ground. Some of these are the aggregating type. And some of these bees are actually, incredibly threatened by anthropogenic change. Again, think paving, compaction, tilling, invasive species covering the ground. Their nesting environments are potentially greatly threatened. Leafcutter bees and mason bees, wool carder bees, these are the kinds of bees our lab mostly studies. These are a lot of cavity nesting bees. You'll often notice them when they fly about because they uniquely put all the pollen on the underside of their abdomen, and you can see that on the top image there. Some of them are bright blue as well, like Osmia lignaria, our blue orchard mason bee. And a lot of these bees, especially the mason bees, are out early in spring as well. So really at the beginning of May or so, we'll start to see some of these species active. And the last one, which is really cool, is our only species of oil collecting bee. This is an image from Charlotte Kaiser in our lab. And this is a flower, Lysomachia, yellow loosestrife. And this bee is a specialist on yellow loosestrife because this bee collects floral oils. It's an oil collecting bee. And it dabs its legs, dabbing up, sopping up all of the oils off that flower. Oils are very, very nutritious, and some bees will use those to make their nesting material as well. What we're seeing here is a male flying in, looking to mate with the female as she collects some of those oils. Okay, went backwards there, sorry. So to summarize there, bees, they all have different needs, and there are ways in which we can accommodate these, right? So obviously one is forage, flowers, right? They need pollen and nectar. Different bees need different kinds. Different bees are active at different times of the year. And so we need flowers for all seasons, right? So thinking about the spring, thinking about the summer, even thinking about the fall. And although I didn't get into this too much, we've also learned fairly recently that bees are not just vegetarians. In fact, they're collecting pollen and nectar and a mixture of microbes as well. And these microbes are feeding on the pollen and nectar in the nest, and the bees are feeding on pollen nectar as well as those microbes. So they're getting that microbial meat. So the floral choices that they make may be driven by more than just how sweet the nectar is. As well as nesting material. So we talked about nesting locations, ground nesting bees, cavity nesting bees, some of the strategies we can take to make those nests when we notice them, make sure we leave them alone, as well as nesting materials. And I've kind of touched on this a little bit, leaf cutter bees collecting leaves, resin bees collecting resin. A lot of bees will collect mud to make their nest or sand, some collect pebbles. We've even seen some of them jam sunflower seeds and stuff in the nest. It's really quite unique. That's a very understudied area of bee research right now. So just to kind of end, I just want to list several things we can do to support wild bees in Toronto, and I mean anywhere you are. I suspect many people here are tuning in from Toronto. So here's that image again of different colors, shapes, sizes of flowers, really focusing on native plants. Very key, and it's not just perennial annual garden stuff, but also shrubs and trees can provide significant resources for wild bees as well. So planting something like this prairie rose is perfect. It's like a landing pad for a bee. It just falls right into that big pile of pollen and nectar. In contrast, this would be a terrible choice for a bee, right? We've artificially selected flowers for massive petal growth because, you know, humans believe this is a pretty thing, but it is a waste of time for a bee who has to dig through to get at what meager resources there are deep inside there. Many lists online about what pollinator plants are best for your particular region. I would start at the Live Green Toronto website where there are great lists to be had. Second, cutting long stems, keeping them bundled. I mentioned raspberry canes, elderberry, sumac. There's many plants that have pithy or open cavities inside the stems. Rather than cutting them all the way down to the ground, bundling up for the bin for decomposition, but bundle them up and put them in the corner of your lot if you have it, or tuck it away because you never know, there could be some bee species nesting in those dead stems. Of course, they could be useful for activities with kids and so forth to create opportunities for bees to nest in your yard. Bare open ground is good. Patchy lawns like this one is excellent. You know, the dandelion tap roots and various plants that occupy our gardens can provide great ways for bees to get down underground to make nests. Of course, the prunellas and the clovers and other flowers that pop up in our lawns are also attractive forage plants for lots of bee species, including many native species. And yeah, as I said, no mulch. You can imagine if you're a ground nesting bee and you wake up one morning and there's 3 inches of bark mulch on top of your nest, I mean, you're stuck. You're never getting out of there. So we want to minimize where mulch is applied. Straw mulch or leaf mulch is best. If you want to get more creative, if you have a south-facing slope in your yard, consider creating like a rockery. Putting rocks out. Bees are like fish or frogs. Their metabolism is dependent on the temperature outside. So when they wake up in the morning, they have to sun themselves so they get enough energy so they can go and forage and collect that pollen nectar. Very different from us, seeking a cup of coffee. But you can see here that bees will nest under the brick, within the brick, on top of the brick, under the rocks. They'll sun on the rocks. So these kinds of structures are quite fantastic for supporting ground nesting bees. I mentioned nesting materials as well. So these are just some samples of photos I've taken from Toronto over the years, showing leaf cuts from different leaves. If you see a plant with leaf cuts in it, thank you. Be proud that you're supporting local leafcutter bee activity. There's someone nesting nearby. Important for the same reason I mentioned this new invasive bee species is there's a growing interest in selling bee cocoons online. We're quite worried about this because you never know where they're coming from. This is one I found on Etsy, delivers to Canada, dispatched from the US. That's technically illegal based on what we can send across the border, live animals. But even shipping all over, we can't always be certain we're shipping the right species. And the one I just showed you here, we hypothesized that one of the entryways to Canada, this bee just arrived in 2018 as far as we know, and it's becoming common in Toronto, possibly arrived because of this mail order system. So we want to support bees where they are, and we can create habitat for local bees and grow their populations. We don't need to buy them online. And lastly, talk to your neighbors, right? So we've got these great resources at the Live Green Toronto site, lots of researchers and community groups working on bees. Get out and hear about what other people are doing, and certainly share what you've learned as well. When you see a bee coming out of a hole in the ground, I mean, thank that bee for being there and don't be too worried about trying to cover it up. Again, lastly, too, lots of ways that we engage with community science and citizen science across the city, and lots of programs that you can tap into as well. So with that, I will say thank you for listening. And if you have other questions relating to the talk, I'm happy to take those now. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Scott. Hi, everyone. I'm Anne-Marie Bainton, and I work for the City of Toronto's Environment and Energy Division. And I've worked with Scott for many years on the pollinator protection strategy and part of the Pollinate TO community grants. And I always learn something new when I listen to Scott's talk, so it's really exciting for me to be here. I will be facilitating the Q&A portion of the event. And so just a reminder, if you have any questions, please do use the Q&A function in the box on your screen. We'll try to get to everyone's question. So thank you so much, Scott, for spending some time with us today. I have to say, I did learn something new, that there's an oil collecting bee. That was something I didn't know. I thought it was just pollen and nectar. So very interesting. I'd like to ask a question because it's really timely right now with the warmer weather approaching and people sort of eager to get into their gardens and clean up and get rid of all those dead stems and leaf debris and whatnot. What advice would you give to those eager gardeners out there that want to get out there and clean up? Is there an ideal time to do so? Is there a temperature that people should wait for? You did touch on the dead stems and collecting them and bundling them, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about what we should do or whether we should hold off on that spring cleanup.
Yeah, I mean, we all feel it, right? When the weather gets warmer, we're excited to get out in a garden and just start rooting around and moving things and things like that. I mean, I do it too. I mean, it's tough because I think the main thing is having diversity in these spaces, right? So not doing everything in all the spaces in your garden, right? So, cutting down some stems so that you can appreciate some elements of your garden. There's nothing wrong with that, of course. but keeping in mind what some of the plant types that some bees might use. Like I mentioned, plants that have pithy stems. I mean, even dill is a good one. Anything that has a pithy or an open stem, leaving those in place is not a bad idea. Beard tongue stems. I know it doesn't maybe look as nice, but if you're interested in supporting bees and being able to experience a bee going in and out of the stem in your garden is kind of a cool element as well, right? So thinking about that is like a design feature. But by no means do you need to do it all. And if you did cut down the stems, even just bundling them up and setting them aside is one way to, reduce the chance that you're throwing those bees into a brown paper bag and getting rid of them. What I would say with cutting stems is I mean, bees don't nest in live plants. They nest in dead stems, right? So keeping that in mind is probably quite useful. And again, stems that are at least with a pith or a cavity that's greater than like 4 or 5 millimeters in diameter. In terms of timing, yeah, most bees aren't active until at least May in our city. And a lot of these are ground nesting bees. So that's another factor too, is keeping the ground, leaving it alone until May as much as you can. Cleaning up some leaf litter is no problem, but try not to till the ground during that time. Most people aren't doing it that early anyway, but it's tough because there's not a real prescription here because everyone's garden is a little bit different. I always just say like keeping things a little messy and keeping things heterogeneous, so not doing it all one way is the best way.
That's really great advice. I like to tell people that brown is a color in your garden too, and it's okay to leave some brown dead plant material for a little while, especially until May when our pollinators have a chance to emerge. We'd hate to see the next generation of pollinators end up in our yard waste, certainly. So speaking of cavity nesting bees, we've got a lot of questions about bee hotels, bee boxes, bee nests. Wonder if you could speak a little bit about someone who's maybe interested in obtaining one. We've all seen those mega, more like bee mansions actually for sale, quite large. What would you recommend if someone's starting out and would like to add one to their property? And for someone who already has one, is there some sort of cleaning routine or something that they should be doing to maintain that bee house?
Yeah, as I mentioned, we've learned that it's a lot of the really common species that use these devices. Some of them are native bees, which is great. And of course, lots of them are wasps, right? So bees and wasps, they're very closely related. They share lots of the same nesting preferences. And so these cavity nesting boxes support all kinds of wasps, which is a good thing too. Many of these wasps are native species, and they feed on aphids. They feed on leaf defoliating caterpillars and beetles and tree crickets and things like that. So the wasps are a good thing. But the point is that with bee hotels, with respect to bees, it's a lot of the most common things. So I wouldn't necessarily advocate that they're a great conservation tool, but they are a great outreach tool, right? So engaging people up close with bees and their activities in a much safer and simplistic and diverse way than a honeybee colony would satisfy. So yeah, in terms of setting them up, I often advocate for southeast facing against some kind of structure that the bees can orient to. So think like a shed. I often advise not to put them in trees because lots of ants and earwigs and spiders, as well, when the trees leaf out, they can shade or obstruct the nest openings, which will reduce the likelihood of them being colonized by anything. A kind of breast to eye level is always great, both for you to look at and also for the bees to orient to. In terms of dimensions of the nest tubes contained within the bee hotel, I often suggest anywhere from like 3.5 millimeters to under a centimeter in depth. Sometimes you'll see them at a store and there'll be these big bamboo reeds. Those will just be spiders. And there's one super invasive bee species, Megachile sculpturalis, that might use them, but generally smaller is better. And if you're looking to make them, probably the best way to do it is to cut up a whole bunch of one of our most invasive plant species in Toronto, Phragmites australis, the common reed. These plants have natural nodes like a bamboo would. And if you have a nice sharp pair of shears, you can cut them very abruptly and create like perfect tubes that are sealed at one end. And that's another important feature. The tubes have to be sealed at one end. If you do that, make sure you bag the seed head though, so you don't go and spread the plants everywhere. But that's one way that community groups can kind of engage in these activities. In terms of cleaning, I mean, the best thing to do is, you know, after a few years is just replace those tubes inside. You can get pipe cleaners and scrape away on the inside, but you never know if you're actually just jamming a piece of wire into a bee nest. You can try to open them up, but then you risk, you know, slicing your skin or something like that. There are other techniques online, and a really great book that's free online is called Managing Alternative Pollinators. And it's from the SARE organization. I can't remember the acronym, Sustainable Agriculture and Research. It's in America, but I can follow up with the link. But if you just type in Managing Alternative Pollinators PDF, you'll get a great book on that. But yes, the point is keeping them clean as best you can is good, because they can harbor parasites as well, which are attracted to the nesting material and the scents of prior nests.
Thank you. So we have some questions here about honeybees and the competition that honeybees and wild bees have, and whether or not honeybee hives are okay, particularly in a city like Toronto. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about you know, what you would recommend for anyone who may be interested in becoming a beekeeper and putting a hive in their backyard or on the rooftop, for example.
I mean, to some extent, there's a to each their own kind of mentality there. Like if you're interested in it purely from a hobbyist's sake, I can't say no, but from a conservation perspective, or if the intentions are to have a good kind of impact on the local environment, that's probably not the best way to do that. Of course, keeping bees is fun and interesting, and you engage with this, you know, thousands of insects and honey, and you know, the stewardship and education and all of these things that are quite good. But in terms of supporting biodiversity, helping the environment locally, I would say that it's not a great thing to engage with. Now, if you are interested, one way that I would suggest doing that is participate in community groups or organizations where there are hives located, and you may be able to volunteer or help out and learn from experts, right? It's not something that you can just go on the internet and learn so quickly. There's quite a bit of mentorship that's often recommended when keeping honeybees, because they can experience quite a lot of high pathogen load, diseases, and so forth that can be spread. The Ontario Bee Keepers Association is a really great website to get started, and they will always advocate for mentorship programs. So, I mean, there are some studies that are trying to suggest in France in particular, how many hives there should be within a given kilometer within a city or a natural area. But ultimately, honeybees are a non-native species that consume quite a lot of resources that might otherwise be consumed by wild bees. The issue from the research side is we don't know how much resources there are in a local landscape. There's billions of flowers all around us, and we just don't know how many wild bees there are, how many hives there are, and what those impacts reflect. Now, it's not just competition for food. We've learned that honeybees can transmit diseases as well onto other bees. So
it sounds like there's a lot of ways that we can help pollinators and help our wild bees, and one of the easiest, maybe most rewarding, is simply by planting flowers, native flowers that they forage on, and maybe leave the beekeeping to the experts who are trained and know what they're doing. So speaking of honeybees, and we all know that honeybees sting, do wild bees sting?
Good question. So, of course, all female bees have a stinger. A stinger is a modified ovipositor, which is like an egg-laying apparatus in insects. And that's an important point. That means that male bees do not sting. They don't have a stinger. So a bunch of the bees out there already can't sting you at all. And all of these solitary bees that I was referring to, every female is her own queen. They don't want to engage in any kind of defensive or aggressive behavior, because if they tear a wing or they break a tarsal segment, one of their fingers essentially, that puts them at risk of being unable to properly provision their own brood cells and pass their genes on to the next generation. So most solitary bees are very small and their stinger can't actually puncture human skin, and a whole bunch more are non-aggressive, okay? Now contrast that with honeybees, which have a queen and workers and drones and a pile of honey resource and all of their baby brood inside the nest. They have developed much stronger, innate defensive behaviors. So what this means is if you are encroaching on the hive, or you are threatening their queen, or some other activity that they deem as threat, they can chemically communicate to one another and say, threat is here. And female workers are willing to kill themselves, put themselves in harm's way, sting you. Honeybees are the only bees with a barbed stinger, like a fishhook. So the sting stays inside of you and continues to pump toxin into to kind of encourage you to leave, right? But what this means, of course, if that sting is a modified ovipositor, when it leaves that sting inside of you, it's disemboweling itself. So the female honeybee workers are willing to kill themselves to protect their queens. And there's another underlying genetic reason why this is. It's called haplodiploidy, and where female workers are more related to themselves than their own offspring if they were even able to have it. So it's important that their queen survives for the success of the colony. Anyway, so there's you're more likely to be stung by a honeybee, a bumblebee, a paper wasp, a yellow jacket, a hornet. These are the social bees and wasps, and they are more defensive.
Yeah, I think we've all have a bee stinging story. Certainly children, when I engage them about pollinators, they all are very excited to tell me about a time that they were stung by a bee. Chances are it was likely a wasp. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how we can engage with children and sort of get over that fear of stinging, and certainly at schools and with parents, and how we can work with them. And just get children to enjoy, there's certain joy in bee watching and just seeing bees go about their business and not paying any attention to us. Is there some advice that you could give to, for children to sort of maybe get over that fear of stinging?
Interesting. I mean, that's a good one. I mean, I will say that when I started studying bees 10, 12 years ago, that was more the question. How do I avoid being stung? How do I create a garden that bees don't like? It's like, and I must say, I never get those questions anymore. They've completely shifted over the last 12 years as like increasing awareness of risk to bees and declines of bee pollinators have increased. There's much more questions around how do we help? So, I mean, the main thing with bees and avoiding being stung, I mean, they don't want to sting you. They are wild animals, right? So we don't want to go and harass them like we would not want to harass a bird or a monkey or something like that. So I think there's something to be said about remembering that insects are animals too. and we don't want to harm them or put them in a risky situation. Again, yeah, that's a good question, Anne-Marie. I think in general, I find it's better to talk about all the positive aspects of bees rather than the negative ones in these kinds of talks, even too, like how amazing is it that in any one garden or backyard or park in Toronto, you may experience 60, 80, 100. I mean, Sarah McKell in Sheila Cola's lab just identified 185 bee species from like 20 locations in Toronto this past year. So there's such diversity, color, blues and yellows, blacks and greens, all doing different kinds of things. Really focusing on the diversity and the beauty of bees, I think means we forget or don't really worry about the sting risk. And again, most bees are non-aggressive.
Yeah, and I think just if you have the opportunity to look in your garden and watch a bee, go from flower to flower and collect pollen, you know that they're not really, interested in you and they're just going about their business. And it's really a joy to watch them do that. And I think all children have, a potential opportunity to do that at their school or in their home garden or in a local park.
Or even a balcony on a flower pot. Like bees are a gateway to the natural world and the interactions, the myriad of interactions that happen even in a big city like Toronto.
And that leads really nicely into my next question. If you do have a balcony, can you grow flowers that bees would like? And maybe leading to the next question, maybe talk about the role that green roofs might play in Toronto in creating pollinator habitat. So not just thinking about habitat at grade, but on our balconies and on our rooftops. Is there potential for pollinator habitat in those places?
Well, we all know the direction Toronto is growing, right? Up. And that is the case many families, many people in Toronto live in apartments, in condos, and have access there and balconies, and growing tomatoes and growing beans or planting some flowers is certainly something that's like therapeutic and really enjoyable for lots of people, whether you live at ground level or not. And yes, we do find bees visiting balconies. I still want to create a study where I work with condo boards across Toronto and we study bees at different heights all the way up the balconies one day. But yes, height is generally an issue. I mean, lots of bees normally will forage on trees, for example, which may be 20, 25 meters, even sometimes high up, right? Some of our large tree species. So it's not out of the ordinary for a bee to seek flowers in a vertical way, but all bees have dispersal maximums, right? How far they're willing to go from their nest, right? And bees are central place foragers. They make a nest in one location and they forage in the vicinity around that. And of course, you want to minimize the foraging trip duration and how far you have to go, right? You want to go out, get what you need, and get back so you can protect your nest from parasites and other animals and so forth. So what we do find is there is an effect of height. There are certainly examples of bumblebees being 16 stories or 24 stories high. Why are they up there? Well, I mean, these are bees that have really far foraging distances, and this is related to their size. So the larger the bee, the further it can forage. And if it's a social bee, like a bumblebee or a honeybee, they can forage really far, like even over 1 kilometer in distance. Whether that translates to 1 kilometer vertically, I don't think so. But nevertheless, if we're thinking about creating habitat above grade, the best strategies are on low and mid-rise buildings, right? Once you get up to the condo at Gerrard and Yonge, it's like 80 plus stories. I mean, there's no real argument, I would say, to create pollinator habitat that high up. But nevertheless, we plant flowers not just for bees, we plant them for ourselves too. So we should remember that.
A good point. switching back to at grade, we do have a couple of questions about lawns and sort of that idea that our traditional turf lawn it's a bit of a food desert, isn't it, for pollinators? There's nothing much there for them. If you could make a recommendation on, what we could do if we wanted to look at shrinking our lawn and maybe replacing it with something else, what would you recommend would be, an alternative ground cover that would really appeal to pollinators?
An alternative ground cover from like a grass lawn. I mean, I'm always much more of an advocate for a diversity and heterogeneity, right? So if I had like a 12 foot by 12 foot, or whatever, 3-4 meter by 3-4 meter lawn, the first thing I would do is never get a plastic lawn, ever. That's the first thing. Second,
you can't in Toronto, just for the record. You're not allowed to do that, so that's a good thing.
Oh, we'll have to talk about this later. That's great to hear. I certainly I find what's appealing is a lawn that, yes, sure, includes some lawn grass. I mean, if you're walking across it or laying down, but intermixing that with some of the charismatic kind of ground cover flowers, right? So again, I mentioned clovers, self-heal, prunella. A lot of these are nitrogen fixing plants too, so they're actually really good for the sustainability of these lawns through time. There's potentillas and other kinds of plants that tend to do quite well in grass lawns. And I mean, one way is just to kind of, a lot of them can be spontaneous and kind of not, some of them non-native, but they still support lots of species. I can't think of a solid like native lawn pollinator grass per se, or like grass replacement in total, but I would just argue for and advocate for diversity in that regard.
That's great advice. Well, we're at time now, and I know there are many more questions. I will invite anyone who has a question they didn't feel was answered here to email us, livegreen@toronto.ca. And I wanted to obviously take this opportunity to thank Scott for joining us. It's always a pleasure, and I really enjoy hearing you speak and continuing working with you on lots of great initiatives. And I also wanted to thank our partners at the Royal Agricultural Virtual Experience for hosting us today and giving us this opportunity to share this information. And thank you to all of the attendees for coming today. If you would like more resources on how to help pollinators, and a lot of things that Scott mentioned, the Bees of Toronto book, the strategy, our grant program, it's all accessible via our website, livegreentoronto.ca. And we will have a recording of this session posted to our Live Green Toronto YouTube channel. So if you'd like to watch it again and share it with others that weren't able to attend today, please do visit our website to access this recording. So with that, I will thank everyone again. Thank you, Scott, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And remember, don't clean up your garden too early this spring and plant some wildflowers. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot, Emery.
Bye.
Bye.